Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we honor the visionaries who built Carter Global into one of the most respected logistics companies in the Midwest. The ballroom erupted in applause as crystal chandeliers shimmered above hundreds of guests dressed in black tuxedos and designer gowns. But I noticed something strange almost immediately. My face had been removed from the founder tribute video. I sat perfectly still at table 17 with my hands folded in my lap, while photographs from the company's history flashed across the giant screen behind the stage. There was my late husband, Richard Carter, standing beside our very first delivery truck back in 1987. There was Daniel shaking hands with investors years later. There were smiling executives, board members, and consultants who had joined long after the hard years were over. But not a single photo of me appeared anywhere. Not one. I stared at the glowing screen while polite applause filled the ballroom around me. The silver bracelet Richard bought me on our 10th anniversary felt cold against my wrist. 23 years ago, I had slept on the floor of our first warehouse during a January snowstorm because we couldn't afford both rent and overnight security. I had balanced payroll books at our kitchen table while cooking macaroni soup on a hot plate. I had driven freight across 3 states with a fever because one late shipment would have cost us our biggest client. And now, somehow, I had disappeared from the story completely. Beautiful tribute, wasn't it? Vanessa said as she appeared beside my chair holding a champagne flute. My daughter-in-law looked flawless in a white satin gown with diamond earrings that probably cost more than our first company van. Her smile was polished and elegant, but her eyes never quite reached mine anymore. The branding team worked on it for weeks. I looked up at her calmly. "Yes," I said softly. "I noticed." Her expression tightened for only half a second before the performance returned. "Daniel's nervous about the speech tonight," she continued. "This acquisition could change everything for the company." The acquisition? Of course. That explained the investors seated near the stage and the unusual number of cameras moving through the ballroom. Carter Global wasn't just hosting a charity gala tonight. They were preparing to announce a major expansion deal, one that would place Daniel and Vanessa on the cover of every business magazine in Chicago by morning. Vanessa touched my shoulder lightly before walking back toward the stage where Daniel stood laughing beside several executives. My son looked handsome in his tailored black tuxedo. Confident. Important. Untouchable. For a brief moment, I remembered the little boy who used to fall asleep under my desk while I worked late balancing invoices. Back then, he used to tell everyone his mother was the strongest person in the world. The orchestra music softened as the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone. "And now," he announced warmly, "please welcome the future of Carter Global Logistics, our CEO, Daniel Carter." The applause thundered through the ballroom as Daniel stepped onto the stage. He smiled at the audience, adjusted his cufflinks, and began thanking everyone who had helped build the company into what it was today. Investors, mentors, board members, his wife, even a former consultant who had only worked there 11 months. My name never came. I lowered my eyes to the gala program resting on the table in front of me. Under the section titled Founders, there was only one name listed now: Richard Carter. I ran my fingers slowly across the glossy paper while something cold and painfully clear settled deep inside my chest. They weren't forgetting me. They were erasing me. The applause continued around me while Daniel spoke confidently about innovation, expansion, and the bright future of Carter Global. But his voice slowly faded into background noise as my mind drifted backward through time. I remembered another winter night nearly 30 years earlier when there had been no ballroom, no investors, and certainly no charity gala. Back then, our company was nothing more than a struggling freight business, operating out of a drafty warehouse on the south side of Chicago, with a leaking roof and 2 unreliable delivery trucks. Richard used to joke that the building looked more abandoned than operational. During our first year, we could not afford proper heating, so I wore 2 sweaters and fingerless gloves while answering customer calls from a folding table beside a portable space heater. Some nights, after the drivers left, I stayed alone balancing invoices until midnight while snow piled against the loading dock doors outside. I still remember the smell of diesel fuel mixed with cheap coffee and wet cardboard. We barely survived those early years. There were months when Richard and I skipped dinner so we could make payroll on Friday mornings. Once, during a brutal February blizzard, One of our drivers quit halfway through a route because the roads were too dangerous. Richard was sick with pneumonia at the time, burning with fever upstairs in our tiny apartment above the warehouse, so I climbed into that freezing truck myself and drove freight through 3 states with an old road atlas spread across the passenger seat. I was 43 years old, exhausted, and terrified the entire time, but I made every delivery before sunrise because losing that contract would have destroyed us. Nobody applauded then. Nobody handed me an award for loyalty or sacrifice. I simply came home, took off my snow-covered boots, and made breakfast before Daniel woke up for school. My son used to spend afternoons inside the warehouse after class doing homework at my desk, while forklifts beeped in the background. He loved the place back then. Sometimes he would sit beside Richard on the loading dock, eating cheeseburgers from the diner across the street, while the trucks rolled in one after another. "One day this company will belong to you," Richard used to tell him proudly. Daniel would smile so wide every time his father said those words. He used to brag about us to his teachers. Once, during career day in middle school, he stood in front of his class and said his parents were building something important from nothing. I still remember how proud I felt hearing that from the hallway outside his classroom. The orchestra music inside the ballroom pulled me back to the present as waiters moved silently between tables carrying crystal glasses and expensive wine. Everything looked polished now. Elegant. Controlled. You would never guess this company had once survived because a tired woman slept on a warehouse cot beside unpaid invoices while praying the electricity would stay on another month. I glanced toward the massive banner hanging behind the stage with the company slogan printed in gold letters beneath Daniel's photograph. Building the future together. The irony almost made me smile. Because the truth was, there had been a time when there was no together. There had only been Richard and me, working ourselves to exhaustion while risking everything we owned just to keep the doors open one more week. And somewhere along the way, the company we built had stopped remembering who carried it through the years nobody else wanted. Daniel finished his speech beneath a standing ovation while cameras flashed across the ballroom like bursts of lightning. Vanessa stepped onto the stage beside him with one graceful hand resting lightly on his arm, and together they looked exactly like the kind of powerful corporate couple business magazines love to feature on their covers. Young, sophisticated, untouchable. I watched them from across the room and tried to remember the first time I met her nearly 12 years ago. Back then, Vanessa Whitmore walked into our lives wearing a cream-colored cashmere coat and carrying herself with the effortless confidence of someone who had never once worried about paying a utility bill. She came from old money in Connecticut, the kind of family that donated entire wings to museums and considered private boarding schools a family tradition. Daniel was completely captivated by her from the beginning. I remember how nervous he seemed the night he brought her to dinner at our home in Evanston. He kept adjusting his tie and asking if everything looked all right while I finished roasting chicken in the kitchen. Vanessa was beautiful, charming, and incredibly attentive that evening. She complimented my cooking 3 separate times and asked thoughtful questions about how Richard and I built the company from nothing. At one point, she even took my hands across the dinner table and said, "Women like you inspire me, Evelyn." I believed her. For a while I truly believed her. After the wedding, she began appearing more frequently at company events, even though she officially worked in marketing for a luxury retail brand downtown. First, nobody minded. Vanessa had a polished way of speaking that impressed investors, and she understood social networking better than anyone in our office. Slowly, however, little things began changing around the company. The old employee appreciation picnics disappeared because Vanessa thought they looked unprofessional. The warehouse Christmas bonuses were replaced with formal corporate dinners at expensive hotels. Employees who had worked beside Richard and me for decades quietly retired or were pushed aside for younger executives with Ivy League resumes and sharp-tailored suits. The company became more elegant every year, but somehow colder too. I noticed Daniel changing alongside it. He stopped wearing the old leather watch Richard gave him after college because Vanessa said it looked outdated. He traded practical conversations about freight schedules and driver safety for discussions about branding strategy and luxury partnerships. Even the way he spoke began shifting. The son who once proudly told people his mother drove trucks through snowstorms now laughed nervously anytime someone mentioned those early warehouse years in front of investors. One afternoon about 5 years ago, I walked into a board meeting and found a design team reviewing promotional material for the company anniversary campaign. Large photographs covered the conference table. Images of modern offices, executive portraits, magazine articles. I noticed every single picture from the company's first decade had been removed. The older images do not really fit the brand identity anymore, Vanessa explained casually when I asked about it. Brand identity. I still remember the strange emptiness I felt hearing those words. As though our sacrifices had become embarrassing details they preferred to hide from the polished version of the story. Over time, my office moved farther from the executive floor. My opinions were requested less often. Invitations arrived. Later and later until eventually they stopped arriving altogether unless Daniel remembered at the last minute. But tonight was different. Tonight, sitting beneath those glittering chandeliers while strangers applauded my son's carefully rewritten history, I finally understood something painful and undeniable. Vanessa had not simply modernized the company. She had slowly taught Daniel to be ashamed of where he came from. And somewhere along the way, my son had decided it was easier to erase me than admit the empire surrounding him had been built by tired hands that once smelled like diesel fuel and cold warehouse dust. Dinner service began shortly after Daniel finished speaking, and the ballroom slowly settled into the soft rhythm of silverware, polite laughter, and quiet business conversations. I barely touched the sea base placed in front of me. Instead, I sat listening to fragments of nearby discussions drift through the room like cold drafts under a door. Investors discussing expansion into Arizona. Board members praising Vanessa's fresh vision. A young executive at the next table confidently explaining how Carter Global had transformed from a small regional operation into a modern national brand under Daniel's leadership. Not once did anyone mention the years before the polished offices in media interviews. Not once did anyone mention Richard's heart attack during the recession of 2008, or the months afterward when doctors warned him to avoid stress completely. I remember those months more clearly than I remember my own wedding anniversary. The economy had collapsed almost overnight, and shipping contracts disappeared one after another. Every week brought another unpaid invoice, another canceled account, another employee terrified about losing their job. Banks stopped returning our calls. One lender actually laughed during a meeting when Richard asked for an extension on our operating loan. By November, we were less than 30 days away from shutting the company down entirely. Richard tried hiding the numbers from me at first, but I found him sitting alone inside the warehouse office one night staring at payroll reports with tears in his eyes. I had only seen my husband cry twice in 36 years of marriage. The first time was when Daniel was born. The second was that night. I failed them, he whispered while snow fell outside the loading dock windows. All these families trusted me. The next morning, while Richard slept upstairs after another doctor appointment, I drove alone to First National Bank wearing the only Navy suit I owned. I still remember the freezing wind coming off Lake Michigan as I walked into that marble building carrying a folder full of financial statements and mortgage documents. The bank manager explained calmly that the company no longer qualified for business credit. The risk was too high. The numbers were too unstable. Then he slid a different set of papers across the desk and said there was one possible option remaining. A personal loan secured against our house. Everything Richard and I owned would become collateral. If the company failed anyway, we would lose our home too. I signed the documents without telling anyone except our attorney. I sold the jewelry Richard gave me over 30 years of marriage. I emptied retirement accounts. For nearly 14 months, I quietly transferred personal funds into payroll while pretending everything was stable, because I could not bear watching loyal employees lose their homes during Christmas. Daniel never knew the truth. Richard wanted to tell him many times after the company recovered, but I always stopped him. Let him build his future without carrying our fears, I said. Perhaps that was my mistake. Perhaps protecting him from the hard years also protected him from understanding sacrifice itself. Across the ballroom, Vanessa laughed softly as photographers gathered around her table taking pictures beside a large donation check for the company charity foundation. She looked radiant under the chandeliers while reporters scribbled notes about generosity and leadership. I lowered my eyes toward the candle flickering beside my untouched dinner plate, and suddenly remembered something Richard told me the night we finally paid off that emergency loan years ago. We had celebrated quietly in our kitchen with grocery store cheesecake and cheap champagne because neither of us had the energy for anything larger. Richard kissed my forehead and said, "One day Daniel will understand what you saved." I used to believe that too. But sitting there in that glittering ballroom while strangers applauded the polished version of our family history, I realized my husband had been wrong about one thing. Daniel had inherited the company. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten the cost of keeping it alive. By the time dessert was served, the ballroom had grown louder with celebration. Investors moved between tables shaking hands while reporters clustered near the stage, preparing for the official acquisition announcement later that evening. I remained seated quietly beside the enormous window overlooking downtown Chicago, watching snow drift slowly past the glass 20 floors above the city streets. The candle at the center of my table had nearly burned down when someone finally approached me without cameras or rehearsed smiles. "Mrs. Carter?" a familiar voice asked gently. I looked up and immediately recognized Walter Green, one of our oldest warehouse supervisors. He had retired 3 years earlier after spending almost 4 decades with the company. Age had bent his shoulders slightly now, and his silver hair looked thinner than I remembered, but his eyes still carried the same steady kindness that once calmed terrified employees during our hardest years. "Walter," I said softly, genuinely surprised. "I did not know you would be here tonight." He gave a small uncomfortable smile while adjusting his old-fashioned tie. Truthfully, neither did I. They invited all retired department heads for the publicity photos. His eyes drifted briefly toward the stage before returning to me. "But I am glad I came." He sat carefully in the empty chair beside mine and lowered his voice. "I saw the tribute video earlier." I said nothing. Walter exhaled slowly through his nose. Richard would have hated this. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The orchestra continued playing softly while waiters moved around us carrying trays of champagne beneath the glittering chandeliers. Across the ballroom, Vanessa stood surrounded by executives and donors smiling for photographs beneath the company logo. Walter followed my gaze before shaking his head quietly. "These people have no idea what this place used to be," he murmured. "They never saw you during the blizzard in 1998, when half the drivers could not make it through the storm." I felt something tighten in my chest at the memory. Walter smiled faintly. "You stayed there for 36 straight hours organizing routes by flashlight because the power kept failing. You remember that?" Of course I remembered. I remembered every freezing minute of it. I remembered handing out coffee from a gas station thermos, while trying to reassure exhausted drivers that payroll checks would still clear on Friday. Walter leaned back slowly in his chair. "Most companies would have collapsed years ago without someone like you behind them." His voice softened further. "The younger executives do not understand loyalty anymore. They understand branding, optics, investors. But people like me remember who kept food on our tables." I lowered my eyes toward the untouched slice of cheesecake in front of me. It had become strangely difficult to swallow anything tonight. Walter hesitated before speaking again. "There is something else you should know." His expression shifted carefully, almost nervously. "A few weeks ago, maintenance crews were told to remove several older photographs from the executive hallway upstairs. Pictures from the original warehouse years." I looked at him quietly. "And?" Walter gave a sad smile. "Your portrait was one of them." For a brief second, the noise of the ballroom seemed to disappear completely. I pictured the framed photograph Richard loved most. The one taken inside our first warehouse where I stood holding a clipboard beside the loading dock in jeans and work boots, smiling despite the exhaustion written across my face. Richard used to call it the Real Foundation of Carter Global. Walter reached into his suit pocket and carefully slid a folded envelope across the table toward me. "I probably should not be giving you this," he said quietly. "But after tonight, I figured somebody should." I looked down at the envelope without opening it. My name was written across the front in familiar handwriting I had not seen in years. "Harold Bennett, our family attorney." I stared at the envelope in my hands while the gala continued around me in waves of music, laughter, and expensive perfume. Harold Bennett had been our attorney for over 30 years. He handled every major decision Richard and I ever made, from the original incorporation papers to the emergency loan agreements during the recession. After Richard passed away 6 years earlier, Harold retired quietly to Arizona, and I had not spoken to him since the funeral. Seeing his handwriting again sent a strange heaviness through my chest. Walter gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze before standing. "I should probably get going before anyone notices I disappeared," he said softly. "But for what it is worth, Mrs. Carter, some of us still remember the truth." I watched him walk slowly toward the ballroom exit before finally turning my attention back to the envelope. My fingers hesitated briefly before opening it beneath the tablecloth away from curious eyes. Inside was a folded letter and a small brass key taped carefully to the bottom corner. The moment I saw Harold's signature at the bottom of the page, I felt my pulse quicken. "Evelyn, if you are reading this, then I fear circumstances inside the company have become exactly what Richard worried they might become." There was more, but I stopped reading for a second as a cold sensation moved through me. Richard worried. I looked instinctively toward the stage where Daniel and Vanessa were now speaking with reporters beside the enormous charity check. They looked completely at ease beneath the cameras. Untouchable. I lowered my eyes and continued reading. 3 years before his death, Richard instructed me to place certain company documents into a private safety deposit box under your authorization only. He believed these documents would never need to be used, but insisted they remain protected in case Carter Global's original legacy was ever compromised. My hands tightened slightly around the letter. At the bottom of the page, Harold had written the address of First National Bank downtown along with a box number and access instructions connected to the brass key. Then came one final sentence that made my breath catch completely. "Richard also instructed me to remind you of something you seem to have forgotten about yourself. You are not merely part of this company's history, Evelyn. Legally, you still control its future." For several seconds, I simply stared at those words while the noise of the ballroom faded into distant static around me. "Legally, you still control its future." I read the sentence again slowly, trying to understand what Harold meant. Richard handled most of the complex corporate restructuring during the company's expansion years, especially after Daniel became chief executive officer. I trusted both of them completely back then. I never cared about titles or ownership percentages. I cared about survival, about family, about preserving what Richard and I built together. Yet suddenly memories began surfacing from years earlier. Meetings with attorneys, documents Richard insisted I sign without worrying over details, conversations about protective clauses and voting rights during the recession. At the time, I barely listened because I assumed those precautions would never matter once Daniel inherited leadership. Across the ballroom, applause erupted again as Vanessa stepped onto the stage beside a giant presentation screen. "Tonight marks the beginning of a bold new chapter for Carter Global," she announced smoothly into the microphone. Behind her, a slide appeared showing glossy architectural renderings of a massive new corporate headquarters in Dallas. Investors immediately began clapping. I looked down once more at the brass key resting silently in my palm. It suddenly felt far heavier than its size should allow. For the first time all evening, something inside me shifted. The humiliation was still there. The sadness too. But beneath both emotions, something colder and steadier had quietly begun unfolding. Because if Harold's letter was telling the truth, then Daniel and Vanessa had spent years rewriting the company's story without realizing one very dangerous thing. They had never actually removed me from. Vanessa stood beneath the ballroom lights delivering her presentation with the kind of polished confidence that made investors lean forward in admiration. Every word sounded carefully rehearsed. Every smile perfectly timed. Behind her, giant digital renderings displayed sleek glass office towers and modern distribution hubs, while reporters scribbled notes about the future expansion of Carter Global. "We are entering a new era," she announced proudly. "An era built on innovation, bold leadership, and the courage to leave outdated systems behind." Several executives applauded immediately. Daniel stood near the stage smiling at her with obvious pride while photographers continued snapping pictures from every angle. I sat quietly at table 17 with Harold's letter folded carefully inside my evening clutch, and the brass key resting cold against my fingertips. Something about Vanessa's words lingered uncomfortably in my mind. Leave outdated systems behind. That was how they saw the past now. As something inconvenient. Something embarrassing. Something to replace with cleaner, more marketable versions of the story. A waiter approached to refill my water glass, then paused awkwardly. "Mrs. Carter," he whispered quietly, There is someone asking for you outside the ballroom. I frowned slightly. For me. He nodded. He said his name is Harold Bennett. For a moment I simply stared at him. Harold was here. I stood slowly from the table and followed the waiter through the crowded ballroom toward a quieter hallway near the hotel conference rooms. The noise faded behind us as we turned the corner, and there, standing near a marble column beneath a soft wall sconce, was Harold Bennett himself. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, more tired around the eyes, but his posture remained sharp beneath his charcoal gray suit. "Evelyn," he said gently the moment he saw me, "I was hoping Walter would find you before the acquisition announcement." "Harold," I breathed softly, "what is happening?" He glanced briefly toward the ballroom entrance before lowering his voice. "Richard feared this exact situation years ago." My chest tightened immediately at the mention of my husband. Harold folded his hands carefully in front of him. "After the recession, Richard became deeply concerned about protecting the company from outside influence if leadership priorities ever changed." I looked at him silently. Harold continued. "That is when he created the golden share structure." The phrase sounded vaguely familiar, buried somewhere inside distant memories of legal meetings and endless paperwork years earlier. "You signed the final documents yourself," Harold explained calmly. "The golden share grants one controlling authority over any sale, merger, or restructuring involving Carter Global. Without approval from that shareholder, no acquisition can legally proceed." A strange stillness settled inside me. "And who owns it?" Harold met my eyes directly. "You do." The hallway suddenly felt very quiet. Even the distant ballroom music seemed to disappear for a second. I stared at him, trying to process the words. "Daniel does not know?" Harold exhaled slowly. "Richard intended to tell him eventually. But after his illness worsened, he worried Daniel was becoming too dependent on Vanessa's influence. Richard decided the protection should remain hidden unless absolutely necessary." I looked back toward the ballroom entrance where flashes of camera lights still flickered beneath the chandeliers. "Tonight they are planning to announce the Dallas acquisition publicly," Harold said carefully. "But the final ownership transfer documents cannot become valid without your signature." I felt my fingers tighten slightly around my clutch purse. "And if I refuse?" Harold's expression remained calm. "Then the entire acquisition stops immediately." Somewhere inside the ballroom, applause erupted once again as Vanessa finished another section of her presentation. Harold glanced toward the sound before looking back at me quietly. "Evelyn," he said gently, "Richard did not protect the company from strangers. He protected it from people who might forget what built it in the first place." I stood there in silence for several long seconds, while the weight of everything finally settled into place around me. The humiliation, the erased photographs, the missing name. In the founder tribute, they had spent years treating me like a sentimental relic from the past without realizing the future they were celebrating tonight still rested entirely in my hands. I returned to the ballroom beside Harold just as the final phase of the evening began. The orchestra had stopped playing, and every guest now faced the massive stage where Daniel stood beside several investors preparing for the formal acquisition signing ceremony. Waiters moved silently through the room collecting empty dessert plates while photographers positioned themselves near the front rows for the announcement everyone had been anticipating all night. Vanessa spotted me the moment I entered the ballroom again. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly when she noticed Harold walking beside me. For the first time that evening, her polished smile faltered. Daniel followed her gaze seconds later and immediately looked confused. Harold had not attended a company event in years. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced warmly, "thank you for joining us tonight as Carter Global enters an exciting new era of expansion and innovation." Applause rolled across the ballroom. Giant digital screens behind the stage displayed images of new facilities, projected revenue growth, and sleek promotional videos featuring Daniel and Vanessa smiling confidently beside investors. Everything looked flawless, carefully controlled. I remained standing near the back of the ballroom while Harold quietly handed a folder to one of the corporate attorneys seated near the stage. The attorney opened it casually at first, then suddenly froze. I watched the color drain slowly from his face as he turned several pages in rapid succession. He immediately leaned toward another executive and began whispering urgently. Across the stage, Vanessa noticed the movement almost instantly. Her posture stiffened. Daniel continued speaking into the microphone, unaware of what was happening. "This acquisition represents more than growth," he announced proudly. "It represents our commitment to carrying Carter Global into the future." At that exact moment, the corporate attorney rose abruptly from his seat and approached the stage with visible tension across his face. He leaned toward Daniel and whispered something into his ear. I saw my son's confident smile disappear immediately. "I am sorry," Daniel said awkwardly into the microphone after several seconds of uncomfortable silence. "We just need a brief moment to review some final documentation." Murmurs spread quietly through the ballroom. Vanessa stepped toward the attorney with irritation flashing behind her carefully controlled expression. "What documentation?" she hissed sharply, though the microphone still picked up enough of her voice for nearby guests to hear. The attorney glanced nervously toward me before answering. "The golden share authorization was never disclosed in the acquisition filings." Vanessa's face went completely still. Daniel looked genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" he asked quietly. Harold stepped forward calmly beside me. "The acquisition cannot proceed tonight," he said in a steady voice that carried farther across the ballroom than I expected. "Not without Evelyn Carter's legal approval." Silence spread through the room almost instantly. Even the photographers stopped moving. Daniel stared at me from the stage as though seeing me clearly for the first time all evening. "Mom," he said softly into the microphone. I looked at him quietly without answering. Vanessa recovered first. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said quickly while forcing another polished smile toward the investors. "Evelyn retired years ago. She is not involved in operational decisions." Harold opened the folder calmly. "Mrs. Carter holds controlling authority over all merger and acquisition approvals through a protected golden share agreement established by Richard Carter after the recession restructuring." Several board members immediately began whispering among themselves. One investor removed his glasses entirely and stared down at the documents with disbelief. Daniel looked pale now. Truly pale. "Nobody told me about this," he said quietly. Harold's voice remained calm. "Your father intended the agreement to protect the company's founding principles." Vanessa turned toward me then, and for the first time in 12 years, there was no warmth left in her expression at all. Only panic carefully hidden beneath expensive makeup and practiced elegance. The ballroom had grown so silent that I could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights above us. Hundreds of people waited for me to speak. Reporters, investors, executives, my son. I stood there beneath the chandeliers with Richard's silver bracelet resting against my wrist, and finally understood something powerful. They had spent years trying to erase me from the company story. But the future of Carter Global had never belonged to the people standing under the spotlight tonight. It still belonged to the woman they stopped seeing a very long time ago. The silence inside the ballroom stretched so long that even the investors seemed afraid to move. Daniel stood frozen beneath the stage lights with confusion and disbelief written plainly across his face while Vanessa maintained the brittle composure of someone desperately trying not to lose control in front of a crowd. I could feel hundreds of eyes fixed on me from every corner of the room, waiting to see what I would do next. For years, I had imagined confronting this kind of betrayal with anger. I thought heartbreak would sound loud, dramatic, sharp. But standing there beneath those chandeliers, I discovered something surprising. The pain was quiet now. Quiet and unbelievably clear. Harold handed me the folder calmly, and I walked toward the stage without rushing. My heels moved softly across the marble floor while camera flashes followed every step. Daniel looked at me as though he suddenly remembered who I used to be before polished offices and luxury branding replaced the memory of our old warehouse years. "Mom," he said again, this time without the microphone. His voice sounded smaller somehow, younger. I stepped onto the stage beside him and slowly turned toward the audience. Investors, employees, reporters, men and women wearing $1,000 suits while drinking champagne beneath crystal chandeliers funded by a company that once survived because two exhausted people refused to let it die. I looked out across the ballroom before finally speaking. "I did not come here tonight expecting recognition," I said quietly. The room remained completely silent. When my husband and I built this company, there were years nobody applauded us. Nobody invited us to galas. Nobody wrote articles about innovation or leadership. I glanced briefly toward the giant digital screen still displaying glossy images of the new expansion project. There were only invoices, sleepless nights, frightened employees, and the constant fear that one bad month would destroy everything. Several older employees lowered their eyes as I spoke. They remembered. But we kept going because we believed a company should mean something more than profit margins and magazine covers. My gaze shifted slowly toward Daniel. We believed people mattered. My son looked down at the stage floor without speaking. I continued calmly. Tonight I sat in this ballroom and watched the history of Carter Global presented to strangers as though the hard years never existed. As though sacrifice itself had become embarrassing. Vanessa stepped forward carefully then. Evelyn, perhaps this conversation would be better handled privately, she said with controlled politeness, though tension tightened every word. I looked at her quietly. You spent years making sure my role stayed private. The sentence landed softly, but the effect inside the ballroom was immediate. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for a champagne glass. I turned back toward the audience. The acquisition will not proceed tonight. A ripple of whispers moved instantly through the investors near the front tables. Daniel finally looked up at me fully. There was no arrogance left in his face now, only shock and something far more painful. Shame. I never wanted control, I said gently. I only wanted the company Richard and I built to remember where it came from. For a long moment Daniel said nothing. Then very quietly in front of everyone he asked the question I never thought I would hear. Why did nobody tell me what you sacrificed? Tears gathered in his eyes before he looked away. I felt my chest tighten but my voice remained steady. Because your father and I wanted you to inherit. Opportunity, I answered softly. Not our fear. The ballroom stayed silent for another few seconds before something unexpected happened. Walter Green began clapping from the back of the room. Slowly at first. Then louder. One by one other employees joined him. Then more. Soon the entire ballroom filled with applause so powerful it echoed against the crystal chandeliers overhead. I looked toward the giant digital screen behind the stage, as technicians quietly replaced the promotional slide with an old photograph someone had pulled from the archives only moments earlier. Richard and I stood side by side inside our first warehouse smiling in work boots and winter jackets covered in dust. For the first time all night, my name appeared exactly where it belonged.